The cold winter night wrapped the house in an icy embrace, but it wasn't the chill outside that made him shiver. It was the unexpected knock on the door that would change everything. Jason was a quiet man. A single father to a beautiful 6-year-old girl, he found solace in his small family. They lived in a modest house on the outskirts of town, a place he had grown to cherish for its simplicity and warmth. His daughter, Lily, had been his world since her mother passed away. The pain of losing her was something Jason carried with him every day, but he found peace in being the one to raise Lily. He had learned to fill the void with her laughter, her curiosity, and the endless love she gave him. Jason's life had been built around routines. He woke up early to make breakfast, dropped Lily off at school, went to his job as an accountant, and then returned home to spend the evening with his daughter. It was predictable, safe, and comforting. There was no room for anything else, certainly no room for the past that haunted him. He had worked hard to push his past aside, to close the doors to anyone who could bring back the old pain. That was until she knocked on his door. Lena, his stepsister. The woman he had barely spoken to in years. The woman who had disappeared from his life when their parents split, leaving only memories of awkward family gatherings and unspoken words. Jason wasn't prepared for the emotions that rushed through him when he saw her standing there, shivering in the cold. She was just as he remembered, but older, wearier. Her eyes were tired, her face pale, and she looked like she had been through a lot. "Jason," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I need your help." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He hadn't expected her to show up at his door. He hadn't thought about her in years. They hadn't spoken since their parents had divorced, and even then their relationship had been strained at best. "What's going on?" Jason asked, his voice guarded. Lena looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "My father passed away," she whispered. "I have nowhere else to go." Jason's heart sank. The suddenness of her words caught him off guard. He hadn't known her father well, but he knew enough to know that Lena had been living in the shadow of his neglect. She had been abandoned by both parents, left to navigate the world alone. And now, with her father gone, she had no place to turn but to him. Jason didn't know what to say. He had spent years building his life on his own, avoiding emotional connections, avoiding anything that might drag him back into the mess of his past. And now, here she was, standing on his doorstep, asking for help. He didn't want to take her in. He didn't want to open the door to his past. He had a life now, a simple, peaceful life with Lily, and he wasn't willing to risk it. But then he looked at Lena again. Her face was a mixture of desperation and pride, and it broke something inside him. He couldn't turn her away. He couldn't be that person, not after everything she had been through. "Fine," he said reluctantly, his voice cold. "You can stay. But just for a few nights until you figure things out." Lena's eyes filled with gratitude, but Jason saw the flicker of something else, something darker, something more complicated. She wasn't just asking for a place to stay. She was asking for something more, something he wasn't ready to give. "Thank you," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "You don't know how much this means to me." Jason stepped aside to let her in, but as he did, a feeling of unease washed over him. He wasn't sure what he had just invited into his home, but he couldn't back out now. The air inside the house was warm, but Jason felt a coldness settle over him. He led Lena to the guest room, which had been vacant for months. It was a simple room with a bed, a desk, and a window that looked out over the backyard. The walls were bare, and the furniture was plain, but it was a room that had always been welcoming to guests. "I'll get you a blanket and some pillows," Jason said, his voice distant. "Make yourself comfortable." Lena nodded, her eyes glistening with gratitude. She was standing in the doorway, holding her bag tightly, as if afraid to let go of it. Jason could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she stood with her back slightly hunched, as if bracing for something. "I'm sorry for everything, Jason," she said quietly, her voice breaking. "I know it's been a long time, and I don't expect you to forgive me for ... everything." Jason froze, his hand on the doorframe. He hadn't expected her to say that. He didn't even know what to say. The past had been complicated, messy, and painful. There had been too many misunderstandings, too many unspoken words. Jason had closed the door to it all, but now, with Lena standing in front of him, It was impossible to ignore. "You don't have to apologize," Jason said finally, his voice softer than he intended. "Just get some rest. We'll talk later." Lena didn't say anything more. She simply nodded, stepped into the room, and closed the door behind her. Jason stood there for a moment, his hands still resting on the doorframe. He felt a weight settle on his chest, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. He couldn't explain it, but it was as if the past had come rushing back, forcing him to confront the things he had long buried. When Jason returned to the living room, Lily was sitting on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, a book in her hands. She looked up at him with a smile, but when she saw the look on his face, her expression faltered. "Dad?" she asked softly. "Is everything okay?" Jason sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yes, sweetheart, everything's fine." Lily didn't seem convinced, but she didn't press the matter. Instead, she put the book down and stood up, walking over to him. "Do you need help with dinner?" she asked, trying to lighten the mood. Jason smiled, grateful for his daughter's constant cheerfulness. "Sure, kiddo. Let's get dinner started." The evening passed quietly. Jason made spaghetti, a simple meal that always seemed to comfort Lily. They ate together at the kitchen table, talking about her day at school, the things she had learned, and the friends she had made. For a moment, everything felt normal again. But in the back of his mind, Jason couldn't stop thinking about Lena. Later that evening, after Lily had gone to bed, Jason found himself unable to sleep. He sat in the living room, staring at the flickering flames in the fireplace, his thoughts racing. He couldn't deny the sense of unease that had settled over him. He had invited Lena into his home, but he wasn't sure why. He wasn't sure if he was doing it out of kindness, guilt, or something else entirely. The sound of footsteps down the hall pulled him out of his thoughts. He looked up to see Lena standing in the doorway, her face uncertain. "I couldn't sleep," she said quietly. "Do you mind if I sit with you for a while?" Jason nodded, though he didn't know why. He was still processing everything, still trying to make sense of the situation. But he couldn't say no to her, not when she looked so vulnerable. Lena sat down on the couch, a little too close for comfort, but Jason didn't move. They sat in silence for a few moments, the only sound the crackling of the fire. "Thank you again," Lena said, her voice barely above a whisper, "for letting me stay here. I didn't know where else to go." Jason nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. The quiet intimacy between them felt wrong, but also strangely comforting. He wanted to ask her about everything about her past, about what had happened after their parents' divorce, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, they sat there, side by side, neither one of them speaking, but both feeling the weight of the unspoken words between them. The past, the betrayal, the things they had never said, it all hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Finally, after what felt like hours, Lena spoke again, her voice so soft Jason almost didn't hear her. "I've missed you, Jason," she said, her words laced with sadness. "I didn't want things to end the way they did. I wanted to stay close, to be there for you, but ... Jason's heart skipped a beat. The way she spoke, the vulnerability in her voice, sent a rush of emotions through him. He wanted to say something, to comfort her, but instead he just sat there, unable to speak. Lena turned to face him, her eyes glistening in the dim light of the room. "I just want things to be different," she whispered. Jason swallowed hard, feeling his chest tighten. He didn't know how to answer her. He didn't know if he could handle this closeness, this tension that had suddenly erupted between them. But one thing was clear this night, this moment had changed everything. The morning after their quiet night together, everything seemed to return to the surface. Jason had hoped that the night's shared silence would fade with the dawn. But as he made his way down the stairs, he could feel the tension still hanging in the air, thick and palpable. It wasn't the cold winter chill that weighed on him now, it was Lena. Lena had been quiet since the night before. After she'd whispered that she had missed him, Jason had barely slept, the words echoing in his mind like a haunting refrain. His thoughts swirled, too tangled to unravel. He had never once thought of her this way. She was his stepsister, a person who had been a distant figure in his life since their parents' divorce. They had never been close, never shared more than the occasional forced smile at family gatherings. And yet, her vulnerability, her need for him, made him feel something he couldn't quite name. As Jason walked into the kitchen, he found Lena standing by the window, her back to him. The soft rays of the morning sun bathed the room in a warm, golden light, but it couldn't chase away the coldness that had crept into the house. She turned when she heard him, a faint, uncertain smile playing on her lips. Her hair was still damp from her shower, and she wore one of his old shirts, something he had forgotten he even had. The sight made something stir inside him, but he couldn't quite place it. She was just a guest, he reminded himself. She was just someone he had let into his home out of obligation, not desire. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice hesitant. "Morning," Jason replied, his voice gruff as he grabbed a cup from the cabinet. He tried to focus on the simple act of pouring coffee, but his mind kept drifting back to last night. To her words, to the look in her eyes. They stood in silence for a long moment, the only sound the quiet hum of the coffee machine. Finally, Lena spoke again. "I didn't mean to make things awkward," she said, her voice tinged with regret. I don't know what came over me. It's just, after everything that's happened, I felt so alone. And last night, when you let me sleep here, it felt like maybe things could be different." Jason didn't know how to respond. He couldn't bring himself to reassure her, not when his own heart was in turmoil. He had spent so long building walls around himself, walls to keep out the pain, walls to keep people at a distance. He had never let anyone, especially not Lena. But then, as she stood there in the warm light of the kitchen, her expression so earnest and vulnerable, he couldn't help but feel something break inside him. The walls were still there, but the cracks were starting to show. "I just don't know how to deal with this, Lena," Jason admitted, his voice raw. "I've spent so long trying to forget the past, trying to move on. And now, here you are, and I don't know how to fit you back into my life." Lena's face fell and she looked away, staring out the window again. Jason could see the pain in her eyes, the same pain that had been in her voice the night before. She had always carried it with her, but now it was more obvious than ever. "I never wanted to cause you pain, Jason," she said softly. "I didn't ask for any of this. I just I just wanted to feel like I belonged somewhere. Like I wasn't invisible." Jason's heart ached at her words. He wanted to say something to ease her pain, to tell her everything would be fine. But he didn't know if he could keep that promise. Not when everything between them had always been so complicated. "I get it," Jason said, his voice tight. "But you can't just come back into my life and expect everything to be okay. I have a daughter now. My priorities have changed. I can't afford to let anyone in unless I know it's safe. For both of us." Lena nodded, her lips trembling as if she was holding back tears. She turned away from him, walking over to the table, her fingers brushing the edge as if grounding herself. "I'm not asking you to let me in right away," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't want to feel so alone anymore. I don't want to feel like I'm always the outsider." Jason's heart clenched. He knew what it was like to feel like an outsider. He had spent years hiding from the world, from the people who could hurt him. But he couldn't just ignore the way Lena looked at him, the way she needed him in a way he hadn't expected. "I'll try," Jason said, his voice breaking slightly. "But I can't promise it'll be easy. And I can't promise that things won't get complicated." Lena's eyes filled with unshed tears, but she smiled anyway. "I don't expect anything from you, Jason. I just want to be here for a little while. Until I can figure out what's next." Jason nodded, not sure what else to say. He could feel the weight of her words, the weight of everything they hadn't said to each other in all these years. Later that afternoon, as Jason was cleaning up after lunch, he heard the sound of footsteps down the hallway. He turned to see Lena standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "I'm sorry if I made things awkward this morning," she said, her voice tentative. "I didn't mean to push you." Jason sighed, wiping his hands on the dish towel. "It's not you, Lena, it's everything. I've built this life for myself, and I don't want anything to mess it up, especially not now." Lena nodded, her eyes lowering to the floor. "I understand," she said quietly. "I won't stay longer than I have to. I promise." Jason's heart twisted at the sadness in her voice. He had never realized how much she had been holding inside, how much pain she had carried with her all these years. He had been too focused on his own wounds to see hers. Before he could respond, Lena turned to leave, but then she stopped. "Jason, can I ask you something?" she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Of course," Jason said, his voice softening. Lena hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Why did you let me stay? I mean, you barely know me anymore. You didn't owe me anything." Jason's chest tightened as he met her gaze. He didn't have an answer for her, not a simple one. There were 1,000 reasons why he had let her stay, but none of them made sense. None of them were clear. All he knew was that when he had seen her standing there, so alone and broken, he couldn't turn her away. "I don't know," Jason admitted, his voice rough. "I guess I just ... couldn't leave you out there." Lena looked at him for a long moment as if weighing his words. "You're a good person, Jason," she said softly, her voice filled with a tenderness he hadn't expected. "You always were." "I never realized that until now." Jason didn't know how to respond to that. He had spent so long building walls around himself, convincing himself that he didn't need anyone. And yet, Lena's words made him question everything. "Thanks," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "But you don't need to say that." "I do," Lena replied, her voice steady now. "You've been kind to me when no one else has been. And I'm sorry for everything ... for making things difficult." Jason didn't say anything more. He didn't know how to explain the flood of emotions that had overtaken him in that moment. But something had shifted between them. Something deep and undeniable. The rest of the evening passed quietly. Lena stayed in her room and Jason kept to his routine as if everything were normal. But it wasn't. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, that the silence between them was the calm before the storm. That night, after Lily had gone to bed, Jason sat in the living room, staring into the flickering flames of the fireplace. He tried to ignore the unease swirling in his chest, but it was impossible. Lena's presence, her vulnerability, had cracked open something inside him, something he had worked so hard to bury. When he heard footsteps approaching, he didn't have to look up to know it was Lena. He could feel her presence in the room like a storm on the horizon. "I'm going to bed," she said quietly, standing at the threshold of the living room. "Thank you, Jason, for everything." Jason nodded, but his heart felt heavy. He didn't know what the future held for them, but he knew one thing for sure: things were never going to be the same again. And no matter how hard he tried to push her away, he couldn't deny the truth any longer. Lena was already in his life. Whether he was ready for it or not, they were both stuck together in this tangled web of emotions and regrets. And there was no turning back now. Jason had never been good with feelings. He had spent the better part of his life avoiding them, building walls to shield himself from the chaos that came with emotions. His own past had taught him that love and connection could break you, could leave scars too deep to heal. But now, as he sat across from Lena at the kitchen table, a deep unease churned in his stomach, and he knew that this, whatever this was, would be more complicated than he had ever anticipated. The days following Lena's confession that she was falling for him had been silent, heavy with an air of unspoken words. It had been days since that night, but every glance they exchanged felt laden with the weight of everything they hadn't said. Jason had tried to keep his distance, burying himself in his work and spending more time with Lily, but it wasn't enough. Lena was still here, in his house, under his roof, and he couldn't ignore the pull between them. It wasn't just the shared history. There was something more, something deeper and much harder to ignore. Lena had tried to act normal, but Jason could see it in her eyes. She was waiting for him to make the next move, to tell her whether what they had felt that night was just a fleeting moment, a moment of vulnerability, or if it meant something more, something that couldn't be undone. Jason couldn't answer that question. He didn't know what it meant. And yet, every time he looked at her, every time he saw the way her hair fell over her face or the soft curve of her smile, something twisted inside him. That afternoon, as Jason was fixing a sandwich for lunch, Lena walked into the kitchen. She didn't say anything at first, just leaned against the doorway, watching him with those soft, thoughtful eyes. "Jason," she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to talk to you." Jason's heart skipped a beat. He had known this conversation was coming, but hearing her voice in such a vulnerable tone sent a shiver down his spine. He set the knife down, wiping his hands on the towel, and turned to face her. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low, more cautious than he had intended. Lena didn't immediately answer. Instead, she stepped closer, standing just a few feet from him, her hands nervously fidgeting at her sides. She looked like she was battling with herself, unsure of how to even begin the conversation they both knew needed to happen. "I don't want to make things worse between us," she said quietly, her eyes meeting his. "But I can't stop thinking about what happened." "About what you said?" Jason could feel the tension rise in the room, like the air itself was holding its breath. He wanted to step away, to distance himself from whatever was happening between them, but he couldn't. He was already too far in. They both were. "I didn't mean to complicate things," Lena continued, her voice breaking. "But the truth is, Jason, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do with these feelings. I don't know how to turn them off." Jason's heart sank. He had heard her, but now, facing the reality of her words, it felt different, heavier, more intense. He had wanted to ignore it, to push it all away, but it was impossible. "I didn't mean to lead you on," he said quickly, the words rushing out of him as if he could somehow put the brakes on the emotions that were bubbling to the surface. "Lena, you're my stepsister. I've known you my whole life, and it doesn't make sense. Whatever this is, it's wrong." Lena's eyes filled with tears, and she turned away, unable to look him in the eye. Jason felt a pang of guilt stab through him. But he couldn't let her believe that there could be anything more between them. It was too dangerous, too messy. "I know," she whispered. "I know it's wrong, but that doesn't change the way I feel." Jason stood there, rooted to the spot, unsure of what to say next. He wanted to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be okay. But the truth was, he didn't know if it would be. He didn't know what would happen if they allowed themselves to explore whatever this connection was between them. Lena's voice broke through his thoughts. "What do you want from me, Jason?" she asked, her tone quiet but desperate. "What do you want me to do?" The question hung in the air, and Jason felt the weight of it press down on him. He could see the vulnerability in her eyes, the need for answers that she had been carrying with her ever since that night. The night he had let her stay in his bed, the night they had shared more than just a roof over their heads. "I don't know what I want," Jason admitted, his voice raw. "I don't know how to fix this, how to make it right." Lena's shoulders slumped, the weight of her emotions clearly taking its toll on her. She had been holding on for so long, hiding behind her pride, but now she was exhausted. She was done pretending like she had all the answers. "I never meant to hurt you," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I never wanted to make you feel trapped or confused or ... Dorn." Jason's heart broke. He didn't want to hurt her. He didn't want to make her feel like this. But the truth was, he couldn't pretend like nothing had changed. It had, and he had no idea how to undo it. He didn't even know if he should try. He reached out, gently placing a hand on her shoulder, and she looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. He hated seeing her like this. He had always thought of Lena as strong, distant, someone who didn't need anyone. But now, looking at her, he realized how much she had been hiding, how much she had been carrying all these years. "I'm sorry," Jason murmured, his voice full of regret. "I never meant to hurt you, Lena, but I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be what you need." Lena nodded, her lips trembling. She understood, but it didn't make it any easier. It didn't change the way she felt, the way her heart ached for something more. "I can't keep pretending that nothing's happening," she said quietly. "But I also can't force you to feel something you don't. I just thought, maybe we could try, you know? Maybe we could see where this goes slowly without rushing." Jason took a step back, running a hand through his hair. The idea of taking things slowly, of letting himself get closer to Lena, terrified him. He couldn't afford to open up to anyone again, not after everything he had been through. But Lena was different. She wasn't just a stranger. She was his family, his blood, and the thought of losing her, of pushing her away, hurt more than he could bear. "I don't know if I can, Lena," he said, his voice full of uncertainty. "I've spent so long keeping my distance from people. I don't know how to let anyone in again." Lena nodded, her face softening as she stepped closer to him. "I'm not asking you to let me in all at once. I'm just asking for a chance to see if we can make it work." Jason didn't know what to say. He could feel the conflict within himself, the tug-of-war between the part of him that wanted to push Lena away and the part of him that couldn't stand to see her in pain. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay when it wasn't. He couldn't pretend that the connection between them didn't exist. But he also didn't know if he was ready for this, for whatever this was between them. It was dangerous, it was complicated, and it would only make everything harder in the long run. "I'm scared," Jason confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared of what this means for us, for Lily. I don't know how to make it work." Lena's eyes softened and she reached out, placing her hand gently on his. "I know, Jason. I'm scared too. But maybe we don't need to have all the answers right now. Maybe we just need to take it one day at a time." Jason looked into her eyes, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the urge to shut her out. Maybe this wasn't something he could control. Maybe it wasn't something he could fix with logic or distance. Maybe it was something that needed to be felt, something that needed time to unfold. "I don't know what happens next," Jason said quietly, "but I'll try. I'll try to figure it out. I don't want to lose you again." Lena's lips trembled as a tear slid down her cheek. "You won't lose me, Jason. I'm not going anywhere." For the first time in days, Jason allowed himself to believe her. There was no guarantee, no promise that things would be easy, but maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to make it work. And as he held her gaze, something inside him shifted, the walls he had so carefully built around his heart beginning to crumble. He didn't know where this would lead, but he was willing to find out. For the first time in years, Jason felt something that wasn't fear, hope. Jason had spent his whole life running from emotions. He had learned early on that feelings could tear you apart, break you in ways that left scars you couldn't easily erase. So he built walls-high, impenetrable walls around his heart, convinced that keeping people at a distance was the only way to survive. He had managed to do so for years, shutting out everything that could cause him pain. But now, as he sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the dimly lit room, he knew those walls had started to crack. Lena had come into his life like a whirlwind, shattering the quiet, controlled existence he had fought so hard to build. She had forced her way through the cracks, slowly, carefully, and now she was embedded in his life, in ways he never expected. Her confession had been a turning point, a moment when the truth hung in the air between them, thick and undeniable. She had been open, vulnerable, and raw with him, something he wasn't used to. She had admitted that she was falling for him, and though Jason had tried to push those feelings away, something in him had shifted. He hadn't been able to ignore the pull, the attraction, the undeniable connection between them. But now things felt even more complicated. They had crossed a line, one they could never uncross, and Jason had no idea how to fix it. For days he had tried to pretend everything was normal. He went about his routine, spending time with Lily, going to work and carrying on with life. But every moment he spent near Lena, every conversation they had, felt charged with an energy he couldn't ignore. It was as if the air between them was thick with something unsaid, something dangerous. And it wasn't just the attraction, it was everything. The guilt, the fear, the anxiety. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading toward something inevitable, something that neither of them could stop. But it wasn't just him he was worried about. It was Lily. She was the most important person in his life, and he had promised himself that he would protect her from anything that could hurt her. The idea of his daughter being caught up in this complicated, messy situation filled him with dread. What would happen to her if things went wrong? What if this ended in heartbreak, in pain, in more scars than either of them could bear? Jason ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. He had to do something. He had to make a decision. He couldn't keep pretending like nothing had changed. And so, one evening after dinner, when the house was quiet and Lily had gone to bed, Jason found himself standing in the doorway of Lena's room. The light from the hallway spilled into the room, casting a warm glow over her face as she sat on the edge of her bed, staring out the window. "Lena," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. She turned, her eyes wide with surprise, but there was something else in them too, something that told him she had been waiting for this moment. Waiting for him to finally say something, anything that would break the silence between them. "I've been thinking," Jason began, his throat tight, "about everything, about us, and I think we need to talk, really talk." Lena nodded, her expression unreadable. She stood up slowly, walking over to him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The tension between them was palpable, but so was the unspoken understanding. They both knew that this conversation would change everything. "What do you want to talk about?" she asked, her voice calm, but Jason could hear the uncertainty underneath it. "I don't know," Jason admitted, his voice raw. "I don't know what this is. I don't know where we go from here. But I can't keep pretending like nothing's happening. I can't keep pretending like everything is fine when it's not." Lena's face softened and she took a step closer to him, her hand trembling slightly as she reached out to touch his arm. "Jason, I don't want to make this harder than it already is. I don't want to push you into something you're not ready for. Jason stopped her with a gesture, placing his hand over hers. "It's not that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's not about me being ready. It's about what happens next. About the consequences of this. About the consequences for Lily." Lena's eyes flashed with understanding, and for the first time, Jason saw the weight of his words settle over her. She had always been so focused on their connection, on the way they had felt that night, but now she was starting to realize the gravity of the situation. They weren't just playing with their own emotions, they were playing with Lily's future too. "I know," Lena said softly, her voice filled with guilt. "I've been thinking about that too. I don't want to hurt her. I don't want to mess things up for her." Jason felt a surge of gratitude. Lena wasn't the person he had thought she was. She wasn't just some naive girl who wanted to push forward with her feelings without considering the consequences. She cared. She understood. And that gave him hope. But even as he felt that hope, doubt gnawed at the back of his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was a dangerous game they were playing. They could never go back to what they were before. And once the pieces were in motion, once they made their choices, there would be no turning back. "I don't know what to do, Lena," Jason said, his voice breaking. "I'm scared. I'm scared that if we keep going down this path, it's going to end in disaster. I'm scared that I'm not strong enough to handle it. I'm scared that I'll lose everything, my daughter, you, everything that I've worked so hard to build." Lena stepped closer, her hand resting on his chest over his heart. "I'm scared too, Jason," she said quietly. "But we can't let fear control us. We can't let it dictate our decisions." Jason looked down at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that they could figure this out, that they could make it work. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be easy. Nothing about this situation was simple. And no matter how much they cared for each other, it would always be complicated. "I wish it were simple," Jason said, his voice thick with emotion. "I wish I could just let myself love you without all the fear, all the consequences. But I can't. I have a responsibility to Lily. I have a responsibility to her well-being, to her happiness. And if I open up to you, if I let myself get too close to you, I don't know what it's going to do to her. I don't know if I can risk that." Lena nodded slowly, her eyes filled with understanding. "I get it. I do. I've always known that you put Lily first. And that's what I admire about you, Jason. You're a good father. You're a good man," Jason sighed, his shoulders slumping in exhaustion. "But that's the problem, isn't it? I don't want to lose sight of that. I don't want to lose my focus on what matters most. I don't want to hurt her." Lena stepped closer, her hand gently cupping his cheek. "You won't hurt her," she whispered. "But you need to let yourself feel. You need to let yourself be human, Jason. You deserve love too. You deserve happiness." Jason closed his eyes at her words, a tear slipping down his cheek before he could stop it. He hadn't realized how much he had needed to hear that. He had spent so long protecting himself, guarding his heart, that he had forgotten how to let someone else in. He had forgotten how to trust, how to hope. "I don't know what to do, Lena," he repeated, his voice breaking. "But I do know that I don't want to lose you." Lena's voice softened. "You don't have to lose me, Jason, but you have to be willing to take the risk. We both do." Jason looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of their situation. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He knew there would be obstacles, challenges, and sacrifices, but Lena was right. If he kept living in fear, if he kept hiding behind walls, he would never find peace. He would never find the happiness he longed for. "I'm scared," Jason admitted, "but I think I'm willing to try." Lena smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. That's all I need, Jason. That's all I've ever needed. As they stood there, in the quiet of the room, Jason knew that everything was about to change. There would be no going back from this. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, they could make it work. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with uncertainty and fear. But Jason was ready to face it because he wasn't alone anymore. And neither was Lena. They had each other, and that was enough to begin with. And with that, they took the first step into an uncertain future, holding on to the hope that they could find their way together.